To the next topic to discuss the ongoing crisis in Gaza. Deputy Boyd Barrett has 4 minutes.
Okay. First of all, can I thank especially thank the Count Corla for agreeing to take this debate on the ongoing crisis in Gaza, and indeed for his interest in the plight of the Palestinians generally and in Gaza particularly. And I also am very glad that the Minister is here. I think a lot of people in Gaza will be watching the recording of this debate. They have specifically, the elected representatives of the Palestinian Legislative Council in Gaza have specifically requested that statements would be made in the run-up to the 70th anniversary of the Nakba, the events in 1948, where over 1 million Palestinians were ethnically cleansed, displaced from their lands, an event which marked the beginning of 70 years of tragedy, of displacement, exile, dispossession, occupation and oppression for the people of Palestine, that continues today and that we witness in all its horror with 45 unarmed protesters, many of them young people, some as young as 14 years old, one young man on his birthday, age 14, killed by Israeli snipers in what can only be described as cold-blooded executions by Israeli snipers of unarmed protesters. Protesters who've been marching to vindicate what are their rights under international law, and specifically UN Resolution 194, which gives people who are ethnically cleansed or displaced from their homes the right to return, something that has been denied to them from 70 years, and in the case of Gaza has led to an absolutely horrific humanitarian catastrophe in recent years, since the imposition of 11-year-long brutal siege by Israel, denying basic goods, being able to go into Gaza Strip, a tiny area of land where 2 million people live, and which has seen 4 savage Israeli military assaults against a largely defenceless population. And I think it is critically important that on this anniversary, as we approach it on May the 15th, that we speak up for the Palestinians and for the plight that they now face, and in particular, given what's being visited on them in recent weeks and is likely to continue over the weeks to come up until May the 15th. We have to speak out, Minister, and we have to do something. Not just condemn, and I've heard yourself and indeed the Taoiseach condemn what is happening, but we need to do something for people who are suffering intolerably and unjustly. And one of the things we could do, and I've been asked to do, and I've raised this with you before, but I want to ask you again. The Palestinian Legislative Council have invited that representatives of this Parliament from across the different parties would go to Gaza. And I'm asking, they're not asking that the government go, although they'd be very glad if the government officially went and met with all groups, and specifically met with the members of the elected Parliament there. Because as you know, at the heart of what's happened in Gaza is a refusal of Israel, and tragically much of the international community, to recognise the outcome of a democratic election. That's what started this, and the suffering continues because of it. So I'm asking that we would do something. I mean, if it's not sanctions, and I believe there should be sanctions imposed on Israel for what it's doing, its flagrant breaches of international law and of human rights, could we not at least send an all-party group over there to witness what's going on and to meet everybody, to talk to everybody over there? And specifically the elected representatives in Gaza, so that we can actually point in the direction of a way out of this horrific conflict. So hopefully I'll get a positive response, Minister.
Well, Deputy, first of all, thank you for raising this issue. It's not the first time you've raised it, and I'm happy to be here to answer myself, because this is an issue that I am greatly concerned about also, particularly in recent weeks, and especially because of the appalling number of serious injuries and deaths to people engaged in demonstrations in recent weeks. To date, 47 Palestinians are reported to have been killed and some 1,500 injured. Some of those shot may have been trying to cross a border fence, but clearly many, or most, were some distance inside Gaza and posing no immediate threat. There are at least some cases where persons shot seem to have been readily identifiable as children or as journalists reporting on events. Every country is entitled to defend its territory, but international law clearly defines the circumstances in which force, and in particular deadly force, can be used against civilians. Such force must only be used in cases of real and immediate threat to life, and only as a last resort. That is, when other methods have failed. The use of force should also be proportionate to the threat posed, and I am not satisfied that these limits have been respected. Israel is fully entitled to be vigilant and cautious when there are mass demonstrations close to its border with Gaza. However, Palestinians also have a right to protest. The use of live ammunition is not a normal approach to crowd control, and the resulting number and nature of casualties in recent weeks has been shocking. Many of the injuries from live ammunition have been severe and life-changing, and as we've said earlier, many have killed. I've made two public statements on these incidents, on the 31st of March and again on the 9th of April. I called on all sides to show restraint, but in particular Israel to show restraint in terms of use of force. Everyone needs to take responsibility to ensure that young people particularly are not put in harm's way. I've also supported the calls by the UN and the EU for an independent and transparent investigation into these events. I've expressed these concerns directly to the Israeli ambassador, and our ambassador in Israel has conveyed my views to the Israeli Foreign Ministry. The intensity of these clashes has reduced somewhat in recent weeks, but with the cycle of protests in Gaza scheduled to culminate in the middle of this month, i.e. next week, I am deeply concerned about the prospect of further casualties, and I call on all parties again, and in particular on the Israeli side, to show restraint and to avoid confrontation. Let's not forget that next week also is likely to see the official opening of the US Embassy in Jerusalem, which is going to add even more fuel to this fire. I would also stress the wider context in which these events have occurred. As I've made clear in all my contacts in the region, the situation in Gaza is simply untenable. If the cycle of violence and depression in the Strip is not ended, events of this nature will reoccur. We know that. The long-standing blockade cannot be accepted as normal. It is for this reason that in my many contacts at EU and international level, I have been particularly active in trying to encourage and promote international engagement on improving life in Gaza. I was there also, Deputy, in January. This is the second time I've been to Gaza. I've made this a priority for my work as Foreign Minister, and it will continue to be a priority. And if people have practical suggestions in terms of how we can be of assistance in that regard, I'll happily listen to them. We are increasing our spend significantly this year in relation to supporting Palestinians, and one of the projects we're supporting is a very large project in Gaza in relation to a solar project to power a water purification plant to try to improve the quality of life there.
Deputy Boyd Barrett, 2 minutes.
Minister, first of all, I think people in Gaza will appreciate much of what you've said. They will certainly appreciate any additional support that can be given, humanitarian support in helping to redevelop and regenerate a shattered infrastructure in this area. But, Minister, the problem ultimately is a political problem. And The question people in Gaza, desperate people, are asking, what are they supposed to do? What are they supposed to do? How often have Palestinians been condemned for armed responses or military responses? Now you can say they were right or they were wrong, but here we have a situation where the people of Gaza have said, OK, we will march with our hands in the air, unarmed, behind banners of Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, and engage in peaceful protest to assert their rights under international law. Not some right that they made up, some aspiration they demanded, but rights that are set down under UN Resolution 194 to return to their lands. So they are asserting their rights to go home. The border, Israel's border, does not trump their right to return, because they were ethnically cleansed in 1948. And it most certainly does not justify shooting people down on unarmed protests. Now the question is, what are we going to do about it? Because unless sanctions are imposed on Israel, they are indifferent. The decision by Trump to move the US Embassy to Jerusalem is a direct provocation. What are we going to do? Now, I'm asking a very simple request, Minister, and I appreciate a response to it. The elected representatives, democratically elected in free and fair elections in Gaza, that Israel refused to recognise, that the Americans refused to recognise, are asking that we would send an all-party delegation, not to meet Hamas specifically, but to meet all groups, including the elected representatives of the Parliament, to hear what they have to say and to look at that destruction, so we can point in the direction of how peace can happen, which is through engagement and discussion, not through the brutality that Israel is displaying.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you asked the question, what can they do? I can understand protests. But my strong advice would be, and there is some evidence to suggest that not all of the protest has been peaceful, Deputy. And so there is an obligation on both sides to ensure that, by and large, teenagers are not whipped up and put in harm's way, getting involved in violent conflict. That does not excuse for 1 minute the fact that 47 people have been killed and well over 1,000 have been injured. But I am saying that there is a responsibility also to ensure that protests, while absolutely understandable, are peaceful. In relation to, I'll be back in the Middle East in a few weeks' time. I don't know whether an all-party delegation to Gaza. First of all, I don't know whether an all-party delegation would get into Gaza. But I don't know whether it would be helpful or not, quite frankly, right now. But I'll happily talk to you about that. My only objective here is to try and find a way of moving a negotiated peace process forward that can provide medium to long-term solutions for people in Gaza, and that they can see some hope for the future. Whether that is removing a blockade, whether it's trying to improve living conditions, whether it's making sure that UNRWA keeps the funding in the immediate term that they need to have to look after. About 70% of the people in Gaza rely on UNRWA for some form of food support or health care. These are the practical day-to-day things that I'm interested in, as well as obviously the bigger political issues that need to be resolved. And I would say that I've probably spent more time on this issue than any other issue outside of Brexit and immediate EU issues as Foreign Minister, and I intend on continuing to put a lot of time into this issue. But you know, your request on the floor this morning or this evening for an all-party delegation to visit Gaza, you know, we need to look at the practicalities of that, to be honest with you, before I can give you a definitive answer.
Very good. Now,